In part 4 of the review, we're going to talk about the institutions of government. So this obviously, for our purposes, right, we're going to be looking at the institutions of the American federal government. That means the legislature, which is comprised of Congress. Of course, we know we have a bicameral Congress, right? The House and the Senate. We also have the executive branch. This is comprised of the president and the bureaucracy. And the judicial branch, or the judiciary. This is comprised of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts. So what powers do each branch have? How do they check and balance each other? Right? This is certainly something that you should be able to answer. Now, we're also going to go through each branch and look a little bit at what powers they have and some of the checks and balances. But not huge depth on any of these things, so you should, if you don't know how to answer either of those questions with respect to each branch, you should go and review that. So the legislature, the legislative branch, right? They primarily function as the lawmakers. So how do they make laws? One consideration is, how is this process different from lawmaking under the Articles of Confederation? We know under the Articles that they required a supermajority for any passage. For the passage of regular law now, they only require a simple majority, but they do require a simple majority of each chamber, which is certainly harder to coordinate than if there was only one chamber, right? Now, how do the chambers differ in their processes? We know that the House, being so large, gives a lot of power to the Speaker of the House to really get things done, to coordinate action, and to smooth things along. We know that, again, because there's so many members, there are strict rules on how much debate can happen, and the Rules Committee, which looks over the vast majority of bills before they reach the floor, can set other rules, like rules on germaneness and on whether or not there will be amendments. This generally helps things go faster in the House, right? Because rules can solve collective action problems. In the Senate, there are fewer rules, right? There's only 100 senators. They serve for longer, so it's a more prestigious position. And in the Senate, they are allowed to sort of exercise that prestige by speaking for as long as they want on whatever they want. This, when it carries on, is a filibuster and can only be stopped with cloture, or if the filibusterer stops speaking, right? Filibusters help protect minority rights, because when a filibuster is used to stop one, you actually need more than a simple majority. You need a 3/5 majority. So the filibuster can help protect minority rights. And while it does hold up legislation, so it could be considered bad, it can also be considered very good, because when we have a country like ours where 51% can decide what happens to the other, what laws are made, even if the other 49% don't like it, it's nice that there is one anti-majoritarian feature built in with the filibuster, right? Now, there are things that can't be filibustered. Currently, certain judicial appointments cannot be filibustered. We also know that reconciliation bills cannot be filibustered, right? So basically, the budget can't be filibustered. But we also know that anything attached to the budget has to be germane to the budget, has to be about the budget. We also know, right, that there's some interesting procedures when it comes to raising the money for the budget, right? Tax laws, they can only be introduced in the House. But, of course, the Senate still has to pass them. Now, what motivates legislatures? Well, first and foremost, re-election, right? Because if they want to keep doing what they're doing, they need to get re-elected. But we also know that they're motivated by making public policy, and certainly by gaining power and prestige, maybe even moving on to higher office one day. But first and foremost, they have to get elected and re-elected to do all this. So how do they accomplish their goals? all sorts of different ways, right? They might take positions. This can mean doing things like in the Senate, filibustering, because even though they know their filibuster might fail, that they might not be able to get the legislation tabled, they may at least be able to get their message out. Tell the public, no, I don't agree with this. They're taking a position, right? They might claim credit for legislation that is passed, even though they're only one of many, many, many people who voted for the legislation. They can claim credit for it. Also, they might do things like casework. And this is especially true of the House, because House districts are so much smaller than Senate districts for the most part, right? Because senators are the senator of an entire state, but except for very, very low population states, there are multiple House districts within each state, so a House member represents fewer people. So House members often do a lot of casework where they help individual constituents with issues pertaining to the bureaucracy, right? So I think I gave the example in class of helping a constituent get an emergency passport, right? That kind of thing. They also can use the franking privilege, which we've talked about since the midterm as well, right? When we talk about congressional elections. They can send out mail. Now, they can't use franked mail for campaign communications, but if you're a Congress member and you send out a postcard with your face on it, nice and glossy, to all your constituents saying, look at all the great things I've done to represent you over the last 2 years, they might not be allowed to say on it things like, vote for me again, or elect me, or I'm running again. But if you get that in the mail and you're not paying that much attention to day-to-day of politics, that might as well be an election communication, right? It certainly keeps you as the legislature in your constituents' minds, gives you higher name recognition, and it shows them what you've done for them. So, who serves, right? We know that people who serve in Congress are more male, whiter, older, and generally wealthier and more highly educated than the average American. But that is shifting. We are seeing more diversity of all sorts in the legislature. So, collective action in the legislature, right? We've already sort of hinted at these things like filibusters, and I talked about the Speaker of the House and rules in the House, right? We've already seen how these can happen. But of course, the big problem is that the legislature must act collectively. Even if you're only looking at a simple majority of each chamber, they still have to get things done, and they have to get a lot done, right? There's a lot of laws that need to be passed, a lot of things that need to be looked at. So how do we solve these problems? Well, certainly committees are one tool, right? Committees can divide labor so that not everyone has to look at every single bill until the committee has looked at it and decided, is this good or not, right? So that can really help reduce the workload. It also helps encourage specialization by having committees, right? Because if you sit on the Agriculture Committee, you're going to learn a lot about agriculture and the laws pertaining to it. But if you sit on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, you're probably not going to have to learn that much about agriculture, right? So it helps people specialize, which allows them to become experts on what their committee does. So if a bill does get released from committee, and remember, most bills do die in committee, but if a bill does end up getting released from committee, the people in Congress who are not on your committee are going to listen to you when you talk about it. And that obviously is contingent on what party you're in, right? If you're a Democrat, you're probably not going to listen to the Republicans on the committee and vice versa, because obviously you want to listen to the person in your party. But because committee membership is proportional based on party control of Congress, we know that there will always be Democrats and Republicans, or whatever two parties you had at the time historically, on the committee. Now, we certainly see other tools in Congress as well, right? I talked about rules already, and there are many other tools like agenda setting powers, veto powers, right? Committees have some veto power in that they can kill bills. So all sorts of things like that. But again, committees really are critical to all of this, as are parties, as I hinted at when we talked about committees. So seniority. More senior members have done this for longer, so they have the institutional knowledge needed to get things done. They also have more chips to cash in when we talk about things like deal making and log rolling, right? And of course, deal making, log rolling is also facilitated by committees because the different jurisdictions help for different deals to be made. Now, moving on to the president, the executive, right? The president has many roles. They are commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They are the chief clerk, basically, right? They execute the laws. They are a bureaucrat. They also are the agenda setter in many ways, both for partisan politics, because they are sort of the de facto leader of their own party, and for Congress, right? They do things like propose the budget. This is seemingly just part of his role as chief clerk, but it also sets the agenda for what Congress is going to deal with the budget. Also, the State of the Union address can set the agenda, right? The president can also be considered a sort of chaplain-in-chief, and that we look to him to lead the nation and soothe us in times of crisis. Why is there only one? Why is there a unitary executive? We've talked about this before, and I encourage you to go look back at slides from our lectures actually on foundations and on the presidency if you're still unclear on that. What power does the president have? Well, the president certainly has a lot of power with the take care clause, right? The take care clause is how FDR, for example, justified a lot of what he did as president when he expanded the presidency tremendously, because the president has the power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, what does that mean? It kind of means whatever the president and the courts say it means. This has, again, given the president a lot of power to expand the office, right? It's how the president justifies things like executive orders, right? An executive order, we know, carries the force of law, but it doesn't have quite the same process to be made. It's not made through Congress. It's just made by the president, which means that it can't have funding attached to it unless it can be funded by money that already exists in the bureaucracy for related programming. And we also know that because it's not passed by Congress, it can be overturned by an act of Congress, though presumably the president would veto that, so it would need to be a supermajority in Congress. And it can also be overturned by subsequent presidents. But still, that power, the power to issue executive orders, comes from the power in the Take Care Clause. Now, presidents can use a lot of their powers to deal with Congress, right? Implicit powers, or inferred powers as they're sometimes called, like the power stemming from the Take Care Clause, but also explicit powers, like the power to veto, the power to appoint people, right? Those powers are explicitly listed in the Constitution, in Article 2. So the president can use these powers to deal with Congress. Right? We sort of talked about veto bargaining when we talked about the presidency way back in the in the institutions unit. So that discussion has a lot of information on how the president can deal with Congress, right? Using this explicit power of the veto. Certainly, the implied power, inferred power of executive orders can also be used to deal with Congress, as in when Congress doesn't want to get something done, the president can sometimes issue an executive order to just go around them. But, of course, we know that the president doesn't have enough power to ever get everything that the public expects of him done. And that's a real problem, right? The president, his power is relatively limited. Even today, when we think of the president as having quite a bit of power, mainly, again, due to FDR's massive expansion of the federal government and the presidency. But as much power as the president has, he never really has enough to meet public expectations. So the president can use his ability to set the agenda, to propose budgets, to veto acts of Congress that he disagrees with, to propose things through executive order, right? He can use all these powers to try to meet expectations. But it doesn't always work, because the more the president does and promises, the more we expect of him. Now, I realize I skipped who serves. For the most part, we've seen white Protestant men. JFK was the first Catholic president. Obviously, Barack Obama was the first African American president. Most presidents have served in prior office, often as governors, because that's another executive position, right? They lead a state. But sometimes as other roles, like senator, right? Barack Obama was a senator before he was elected president. And on rare occasions, they've done none of that, right? George Washington hadn't been in any elected office before. Now, he had been commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army, but he had not served in elected office. Trump, obviously, to bookend the thing, hasn't served in elected office either. But he had done other things to get on the public radar. It's very rare for an unknown to become president. Even back at the very early days of the Constitution, the people who became president were relatively well known. And again, had typically served in elected office before. Now, back to the public expectations of the president, and how the president doesn't always meet the expectations. One thing that the president does have at his disposal is the bureaucracy, right? But we know that the bureaucracy hasn't been enough to help either. It got dramatically expanded by FDR. Things like the Social Security Administration obviously were created by Congress at FDR's prompting when they passed the Social Security Act, which created the Social Security program. That's administered by the bureaucratic agency, the Social Security Administration, right? So we have a bureaucracy to help administer laws. That is their primary function, to help the president execute the law. But the bureaucracy, as much as it's expanded, hasn't necessarily expanded as much as the president needs in order to get everything done, right? A good example now is the recovery or stimulus checks that many people are getting. It's taking quite a long time for everyone to get it. And if the IRS doesn't have the exact right type of information from you, for example, if last year when you filed your tax return, you didn't get money back, but you owed money, so you put your bank account information to pay them, they can't use that information to pay you this check. You actually have to go in and enter your bank account information for the direct deposit from them, right? So that's because the IRS, part of the bureaucracy, the part that happens to be administering this, isn't big enough to really deal with the incredible technical hurdles that this law, especially the short turnaround of this part of the law, has entailed. We've seen the same things with the business loans under the Recovery Act as well. It's very difficult for the bureaucracy to actually administer these programs quickly because the bureaucracy is large, but it's slow, and the country is even larger, and it tends to demand very quick action. So we know that the bureaucracy, while it does execute the laws, might do it slowly. Now, who serves in the bureaucracy? How has that changed? Right? We saw the shift from the early Federalist bureaucracy, where we saw lifetime appointment, not lifetime appointments, but rather you generally served for life and you could even pass it on. It was sort of like private property, but the emphasis was on getting the right people to serve. To a Jacksonian bureaucracy, which became dominated by the spoils system or rotation in office, where people rotated through very quickly, it became very difficult to get the right people to serve, to eventually a merit system, where again the emphasis was on getting the right people to serve, but balancing the idea of not creating sort of personal property out of public office. Now, why do we have red tape? Primarily to keep these bureaucrats in check, because it is difficult to fire a merit-based bureaucrat, because we don't want them to be fired just on the basis of politics. We have to keep them in check, and to keep them in check, we generally have red tape. So one of the problems with red tape is it makes things slower, right? The fact that you have to go in and enter your direct deposit information, even though they have your account information to take money from you, is a pain. It makes things slower, but it's also red tape, and there for a reason as well, because maybe not everyone wants the money taken out, put into the account where they had money taken out, right? Some people also might have paid by credit card or by check. So rather than trying to deal with each case by case, blanket rule, if you didn't have direct deposit information last time because you weren't getting a tax refund, you have to enter it now, right? So that red tape is there to protect us, to make sure we get the money where we want it, but it does slow things down and make it annoying. Now, we also know, right, we talked about this in earlier review slides, that there are issues with things like agency loss. When the president delegates this power to the bureaucracy, all this power to execute the laws is basically delegated by him to the bureaucracy. But that means that he doesn't have control over everything that gets done. And it would be impossible for him to have control. He has to delegate. But in delegating this power, he does lose some control. Now, the judiciary, what is that? It's our third branch, right? And we know it's often been called the weakest of the branches. What are its weaknesses? Well, it has to hear the Supreme Court certainly has to hear all 9 justices have to hear all the cases, so they can't hear many cases. So it's slow, and it can't do that much. But it tries to overcome these weaknesses and has done so pretty well with the power of judicial review. Right? This was established by Chief Justice Marshall in the case Marbury versus Madison. And in this, he basically said that the court is designed to review the law, right? And to review specifically the Constitution. So if any law violates the Constitution, it is the court's power and duty to say that that law is invalid because the Constitution can't be violated, right? So any law that violates the Constitution cannot be law, and it is up to the Supreme Court to say that. So that's the power of judicial review, to determine whether a law is constitutional. So that's really broad power. And obviously it depends on how the court interprets the Constitution and how the court interprets the law. So gives, again, the court a lot of power. Now, how many cases does the court hear? What types of cases? Why lifetime tenure? Those kind of things, right? We talked about a lot in class and on the review slides for the midterm, so I'll let you go back to those. The errors of the court, that's not going to be as big of an issue here, but remember, of course, that the court tends to take cases of unsettled areas of law, so the errors of the court generally correspond with times when certain laws were unsettled, right? Currently, we could say that we're in sort of the era of civil rights and civil liberties. Maybe, probably. There's a little question mark about whether that's been resolved or not. Now, what are civil liberties? Civil liberties are limits on government power. They are protection from the government. So they differ from civil rights in that civil rights are protections by the government. What liberties do we have? Well, we have things like freedom of speech and press, freedom of religion. Don't forget that comes with two parts. The free exercise clause. We can exercise whatever religion we would like to exercise. The government can't prevent us from exercising our own religion. And the establishment clause, which means the government also cannot establish an official religion. So that freedom of religion has those two parts, right? Again, it protects us from government telling us what to worship or what we can't worship. So I said speech, press, religion. Those are 3 of the 5 from the First Amendment. The others are petition and assembly, right? They can't stop us from petitioning them. They can't stop us from assembling, assuming we are assembling peacefully, right? Obviously, we know that there are limits on our freedoms here. We can't just assemble a mob, right? The assembly has to be peaceful. Speech, right? We can't incite violence. We can't use speech to defraud people, right? That's fraud. We can't commit libel, though, right? We know that libel is really hard to prove if you're a public figure trying to sue someone for libel, especially if that someone is the media, because then also the freedom of the press comes into things. What types of speech are protected and what's not protected? We certainly talked about this a lot before the midterm, so I'm going to let you go back and review the notes for that.